Okay, so let's unpack this. 10 years ago, the Middle East and North Africa they were in the middle of a geopolitical earthquake.
That's a great way to put it. It was a time of unprecedented political hope.
Right. We saw millions of people, from Tunisia all the way through Egypt, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, just taking to the streets.
They were standing up and demanding dignity, accountability, and really the basic right to freedom.
And that moment, that breaking of the decades-old wall of fear, it all culminated in the fall of leaders like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt.
It truly was world-shattering. But now, a decade later, the sources you shared with me paint a picture that is, fundamentally the opposite.
Yeah, it's a complete reversal. These sources, and they include everything from on-the-ground eyewitness accounts to hard economic data and some really deep political analysis, they show how that initial, almost euphoric optimism
Has curdled into what many analysts are now very soberly calling a lost decade.
Exactly. The narrative that the sources build is just grim. We're talking about widespread authoritarian restoration, escalating civil wars that are pulling in global powers.
And just systemic economic collapse across these key nations.
So we're essentially analyzing a massive political rollback. We're looking at how countries that saw this incredible revolutionary change have ended up in situations that are, in some cases, even more heavily repressed.
And more impoverished than they were before that initial spark in 2011.
So our mission for this deep dive is to move beyond those initial headline moments, the big spectacular images of crowds in Tahrir Square.
Just falling statues, all of that.
Right. And to really analyze the deep structural and often very complex issues that allowed this dramatic reversal to happen.
We need to dissect the grim realities in nations like Syria, Egypt, Libya, and Bahrain. And I think we also need to internalize the very hard lessons learned by the activists who staked everything on the idea that change was not just possible, but inevitable.
Let's start right at the bottom then. Let's focus on the sheer physical hardship in a country where the regime ultimately held on through just sustained and brutal force.
Yeah.
Syria. The sources focus on government-held areas as of early 2021, and the term used to describe daily life is an absolute gut punch. They call it a portrait of everyday humiliation and suffering.
That phrase, everyday humiliation and suffering, is the perfect distillation of systemic collapse.
How so?
Because it moves right past the large-scale death toll, which is horrific enough, and it focuses on the minute-by-minute grinding struggle for existence. The sources document a reality where the entire population is just perpetually preoccupied with the next necessity.
And the most immediate, crushing symbol of this scarcity is the queue, the line.
The lines for everything.
The sources tell us these lines have become so ubiquitous that the journalist Ibrahim Hamidi famously dubbed the country the Republic of Queues.
And these aren't just, quick stops at the market. They are life-consuming experiences that dictate the entire rhythm of the day.
So for fuel, for example, what are we talking about?
We are talking about lines that stretch for miles outside gas stations. The average waiting time to fill a standard tank is a soul-crushing 5 hours.
5 hours.
5 hours. We read accounts of residents resorting to these desperate tactics like parking their cars overnight, sometimes with someone sleeking inside, just to claim a spot in line. Then they'd return early the next morning to fill up.
The desperation is so intense that people carpool or they just walk for hours across cities, specifically to avoid wasting this tiny allowance of precious fuel they can't afford to replace.
It's a total reshaping of civil life. Everything is built around the single objective of not running out of basic resources.
And this scarcity mentality defines everything, right? It's not just fuel.
Not at all. We see chaotic, equally long waits at bakeries just to secure the basic rationed family quota of 2 packs of bread a day.
And the economic context for all of this it's just staggering. The sources indicate that food prices surged an astonishing 230% in the preceding year alone.
230%. That inflation would destabilize any nation on Earth.
But the sources also give us a metric that illustrates the complete devaluation of work itself.
Yeah, this part is just shocking. The average monthly salary of a state employee, so someone who theoretically had a stable job.
Right.
It plummeted from around $170 a year ago down to just $15 to $20.
$15 to $20 a month.
A month. When you have that kind of 3-digit inflation combined with that kind of income collapse, that isn't just poverty. That is a systemic failure of the state to sustain human life.
You cannot sustain a family on that. You can't even sustain yourself.
You can. We had the account of a woman in Damascus whose husband lost his job, and it forced her to take up part-time teaching just to cope. She described watching their savings, which were once meant for their children's future,
Just evaporating.
evaporating fast, in her words, just to cover the absolute basics.
So the mechanism the regime uses to manage this catastrophe, and this is key to simultaneously maintain control, is this rationing system.
The smart cards.
Right. Families depend entirely on these electronic smart cards to get their subsidized and rationed goods. And that includes fuel, gas canisters, tea, sugar, rice, and bread.
And that smart card system is, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers a lifeline, ensuring no one completely starves.
But on the other,
It creates this intense dependence on the state. It allows the regime to control movement and, more importantly, to punish dissent by simply turning off the tap.
and even with the cards, dignity is just removed from the equation. You're still pushing, shoving, fighting in these long lines just to get your ration.
Exactly. And then you have the sheer physical conditions, especially during the winter. They're just unbearable.
The power grids are collapsing.
Completely. Power is severely rationed. It's cut for 4 hours. For every 2 hours it's on, sometimes much longer.
So because gas bottles were so scarce, the less affluent, the people with no other options, they had to resort to using these toxic old wood heaters for warmth.
Which then forced children to rummage through trash just to find materials to burn. Anything. Plastic old shoes.
It's a nightmare. And this cycle of scarcity and exhaustion, it leads directly to the core political insight of this whole section.
Which is that Assad's rule, propped up by Russia and Iran, is not threatened because of this widespread discontent.
It's actually stabilized by it.
Precisely. It's a profound, if deeply cynical, political calculus.
So you're suggesting that the regime keeps the population so focused on securing their next meal, or their next liter of fuel, or the next hour of electricity.
That they are, in the words of one source, too busy with their own survival to organize politically or to demand a transition or even to just contemplate reform.
They're exhausted. They're preoccupied.
And they're constantly fearful of losing their smart card privileges or their tenuous position in the queue. The regime's tactic is two-pronged. You crush the visible organized dissent with force.
But you also structurally maintain this baseline level of widespread individual desperation.
It's brutally effective, and the regime is actively working to restore those walls of fear, even among its supposed base. We saw recent detentions, even of a prominent state TV anchor, just for posts on social media that were deemed critical.
So the message is clear. Loyalty is not enough. You need absolute public silence.
Meanwhile, Assad, who continues to blame the starvation of his own people on U.S. sanctions, he calls them economic terrorism, has managed to cement his power despite the nation's total collapse.
Which provides this grim confirmation of what one journalist stated, that in 10 years of war, the Syrian regime did not offer a single concession.
Not one. There is no horizon. There's no possibility of compromise. The expectation is not that things will get better, but that they will only get worse.
And that makes the calculus for just remaining quiet and surviving extremely compelling for the average citizen.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's pivot now to Egypt. This provides a really stark contrast. The initial protest was, successful. Hosni Mubarak was gone, and quickly, in February 2011.
But the authoritarian restoration that followed was so swift and so complete that observers and exiles now describe the current state under President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi as even more oppressive than the Mubarak era.
We were saying something.
It's saying a lot. The Egyptian story is the textbook case of the deep state reasserting itself.
What do you mean by that exactly?
The sources highlight that the military has historically been this crucial and often popular national institution. Almost every non-interim Egyptian president, with the sole exception of the very short-lived Mohamed Morsi, has come from the military establishment.
So the revolution managed to remove the figurehead, Mubarak.
But it left the entire structural apparatus, the military, the intelligence services, their vast economic enterprises, completely intact.
And President el-Sisi, who was the defense minister when he overthrew Morsi in 2013, has spent the years since then doing something fascinating.
He's been consolidating deeply personalized power within that existing military structure.
To prevent what happened to Morsi from ever happening to him.
Exactly. His consolidation efforts have been ruthless and systematic. The sources detail a consistent pattern of purging and reshuffling figures, even those who participated in the coup that brought him to power.
Like Khaled Fawzi, right? The former head of the General Intelligence Directorate.
A very powerful figure. Sisi understands that his own power came through the military hierarchy, so he fears a rival powerful figure emerging from within it.
So he replaced these key figures with absolute loyalists, like his chief of staff, Abbas Kamel.
But the most telling move, the one that really shows the personalization of power, is the appointment of his own sons, Mustafa and Mahmoud, to senior, powerful intelligence roles.
That is a classic authoritarian move.
It's a deliberate strategy to ensure no rival power base can emerge. Unlike under Mubarak, where you had powerful figures like Field Marshal Tantawi or intelligence chief Omar Suleiman who had their own loyalties.
And could challenge the president.
Sisi recognized that. So by placing family and absolute trusted loyalists in these critical nodes of the deep state, he has fused his personal authority with the institutional power of the military.
And that fear translated into just brutally crushing any political thought that originated within the military establishment during the 2018 election cycle.
The speed and finality of these actions are stark reminders of the regime's control.
Take Ahmed Shafik, a former Air Force commander, a military-backed candidate in 2012. He announces his candidacy.
And he simply disappeared from his home in the UAE. He later reappeared with a very strangely worded Twitter announcement confirming he would not be running.
And what about the former Army Chief of Staff, Sami Anan?
He was arrested immediately after his announcement and sentenced.
And perhaps the clearest example of the regime's zero-tolerance policy was Colonel Ahmed Kansowa, an Army engineer.
Yes, he posted a video announcing his candidacy while still in military uniform.
And was sentenced to 6 years in jail. The message here is that the military serves the current leader, period, not the nation's political life.
And Sisi went beyond just eliminating challengers. He formalized the military's political control through constitutional guarantees.
Okay, this is where we need to spend some time. Let's unpack this concept you raised earlier. The military's super-constitutional status. What did the 2019 Constitution actually do to cement their power? And why does this make the political reversal in Egypt so hard to undo?
This is a critical point that analysts really stress. The 2019 Constitution explicitly acknowledges and grants the military a formal super-constitutional status. It places them above the civilian government's legal authority in crucial areas.
How so? What does that mean in practice?
Specifically, the Constitution grants the military the unilateral right to determine if and when it should intervene in politics and government. And this is often defined under this very broad umbrella of protecting the Constitution and democracy.
So what does that practically mean for a future civilian government? Let's say 10 or 20 years from now, a genuinely democratic movement were to win an election. Could they reform the military or hold them accountable?
Legally, it would be extremely difficult, maybe impossible, without the military's own consent.
So they've basically given themselves a permanent veto.
That's exactly it. By enshrining the military's right to intervene, the Constitution reserves the ultimate power to remove any president or government they deem unsuitable. It doesn't matter if that government was democratically elected. The military has legally reserved the role of the ultimate power broker.
So the door to genuine civilian transition has been legally bolted shut.
It's an institutionalized veto over democracy.
When we look at Egypt and Syria, we're seeing two variations on a theme. One regime crushed its people into submission through collapse and deprivation.
And the other used the deep state to quickly and legally bolt the door on any future democracy.
Let's circle back to Syria for a moment to look at the massive human cost and the deep, abiding trauma of the conflict, particularly the descent into sectarianism.
The Syrian uprising began with these hopeful small protests in Dara in March 2011. They were sparked by the arrest and torture of teenage boys for writing anti-government graffiti.
And when the regime responded with deadly force killing 2 protesters on March 18th, it was a shock to the system.
A huge shock. And the sources relate that feeling from activists like Ahmed al-Musalmeh, who helped organize the rallies that day. They believed that in the age of social media and satellite stations and instant global connection,
that the rulers couldn't possibly get away with the kind of mass slaughter Hafez Assad conducted in Hama back in 1982.
They completely miscalculated the regime's ruthlessness and the world's ultimate attention span. Not only did the mass slaughter happen, but the vicious nature of the conflict fueled this rapid, tragic descent into sectarian hatred,
pitting the largely Sunni Muslim rebellion against Assad's Alawite-centered state.
We have a very stark admission from an activist, Nidal Al-Amari, who initially just dove into setting up a media center. He said that as the conflict grew, his political fear turned into spite and hatred.
He admitted to hating Shiites and Alawites.
Yes, though he now actively works to combat that hatred, telling himself that not every Alawite supported Assad. But it shows how effective the conflict was in turning a political uprising into a deeply personal sectarian trauma.
And that personalization of trauma seems central to the Syrian experience. We have the horrifying account of Omar al-Shogur.
Arrested at just 15, he spent 3 years in the notorious Branch 215 in Damascus, a place people grimly called the Branch of Slow Death. He witnessed the death of his two cousins, Rashad and Bashir, while he was imprisoned.
Before we move on, I want to pause on that account for a moment, because the sources detail a level of deliberate psychological cruelty that goes beyond just keeping people quiet.
Yes.
He realized quickly that the guards weren't just torturing the prisoners physically. They were deliberately creating an environment where the prisoners were forced to turn on each other just to survive.
It's the ultimate destruction of human dignity. Think about the conditions described. A father killing his own child for a piece of food.
Brothers fighting each other just for a small space to sit down because the rooms were too small for the sheer number of detainees.
Al-Shogur noted that while growing up, he learned a father would sacrifice his life for a child. But in Branch 215, he witnessed the deliberate destruction of that most fundamental social bond.
It was a calculated move by the dictatorship to destroy the capacity for community, for resistance, for anything human.
He was only smuggled out after 3 years when his mother managed to bribe the guards, who then staged a mock execution to facilitate his release. But that trauma lives on.
Of course it does.
Absolutely. The sources note Al-Shogur, who is now in Germany, still wrestles with the memories and the resulting hatred, even as he rationally works against it. He worries constantly about regime loyalists, the Shabiha living among the refugees in Europe, potentially targeting dissidents.
The experience fundamentally taught him the true, unvarnished face of dictatorship.
And finally, let's look at Dara, the birthplace of the revolution today. The source material notes that while government forces, backed by Russia, overwhelmed the province in 2018, it is far from truly controlled.
It's a deeply volatile scenario, managed by this unique Russia-mediated arrangement.
That arrangement is a sign of an active, frozen conflict. Assad dominates the military landscape, but he cannot outright win the hearts and minds of the people, nor can he fully trust the local population.
So in some areas, rebel fighters who agreed to reconcile sometimes remain in charge of security.
Right, including some who joined the Russia-overseen Fifth Corps. This creates a deeply tenuous, simmering environment where the population is still rife with dissent, perched, as one source put it, on the rim of an active volcano.
The conditions for revolution might be suppressed by the sheer need for survival.
But the resentment and the capacity for organization are still boiling just underneath the surface.
Okay, moving beyond the Syrian quagmire, let's turn our attention to Libya. This is a case where Western intervention succeeded in quickly removing the dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, in October 2011.
Yes, but instead of the expected democracy, the result was immediate, violent, and complete fragmentation.
And the sources repeatedly stressed that Gaddafi had spent his 4 decades in power systematically destroying any viable state institution.
He ensured that only his personal rule held the country together. So once he was removed, the vacuum was immediate and profound.
Made catastrophically worse by the sudden, uncontrolled flood of vast numbers of weapons onto the streets.
A Libyan insider noted that the anti-Gaddafi forces were intoxicated at the time, and they didn't realize the challenges and dangers that lie ahead.
The dangers being a fragmented country with a lot of weapons.
A lot of weapons. There was no central authority, no national identity beyond Gaddafi's control, and suddenly everyone had an AK-47.
That fragmentation led directly to chaos, creating an immediate opening for transnational extremist groups.
We saw the Islamic State, ISIS, successfully take over cities like Sirte and stage attacks across the country, though they were later driven back by international forces working with various Libyan militias.
But the core conflict never resolved itself into a political agreement. What we see today is a full-blown, internationalized proxy war. Foreign powers are supplying arms, money, even troops.
The current fighting is an internationalized battle of wills. It pits the ambitions of the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia against the rival interests of Turkey and Qatar.
And all these external powers are backing different militias, turning Libya into a geopolitical chessboard.
And beyond those regional rivals, you have Russia and France also actively involved. They've established military bases and are backing various factions.
The sources noted that nearly 20 countries are involved in the 2020 Berlin Conference, which was supposed to decide Libya's fate.
20 countries. That staggering number just underscores how deeply external powers are invested in the country's division, making a genuine, internal, Libyan-led resolution almost impossible.
And you can trace the initial naivete of the uprising right back to the start. The photojournalist's account from Sirte in 2011 is incredibly illustrative.
He described the anti-Gaddafi fighters as often young and inexperienced, carrying their AK-47s as casually as they did their mobile phones and cigarettes.
And some of them appeared to be fighting for fun, despite the high risk.
That casual approach to combat highlights a critical lack of organized command, of long-term political planning, and disciplined hierarchy among the groups that seized power.
They were, in the words of one source, an eccentric brotherhood of combatants.
But they were not a replacement government ready to govern a vast, complex, oil-rich country.
The resulting tragedy is that this lack of institutional structure allowed the conflict to become a playground for regional and global rivalries.
Which led to a military stalemate and a frozen conflict that benefits the external players far more than the Libyan people themselves.
And as the Middle East descended into this massive regional shambles, from the chaos of Libya to the despair of Syria, the sources indicate that the world itself just gradually moved on.
Let's discuss this global disengagement.
The sources explicitly state that while the region is teetering on the brink of humanitarian catastrophe, the world's focus has shifted dramatically elsewhere.
That's a really significant insight. Global attention, it's a finite resource, and it has pivoted almost entirely to more pressing worldwide challenges.
Like the COVID-19 pandemic, the existential threat of climate change.
And new acute crises erupting elsewhere, like in Ethiopia's Tigray region or the major geopolitical shift caused by the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan.
The Mideast crises has simply been crowded out of the international news cycle and the diplomatic agenda.
And meanwhile, the situation in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen just continues to deteriorate rapidly, marked by skyrocketing poverty that affects millions.
The economic devastation in some of these places is so profound that we have this incredibly shocking and very provocative analogy about Lebanon.
That analogy is crucial to understanding the new type of danger facing the region. The source suggests that a Lebanese civilian today is probably more likelihood to die from medicine shortages in 2021 than there was from a bullet in the 1970s and 1980s.
Wow. Let that sink in.
It's a stark comparison. It contrasts the direct, acute violence of the Civil War era with the slow, systemic violence of state collapse.
That statement vividly illustrates that the economic implosion is eating in the very pillars of the state, the health system, food security, electricity generation, in a way that is arguably more dangerous.
And becoming irreversible faster than the civil conflicts of the past. It's an implosion from within, driven by neglect and financial ruin.
And the fear among analysts is that this widespread economic failure, this general Mideast shambles, stems from a growing sense of Western hopelessness.
Driven by war weariness and donor fatigue after so many years of crisis management. They don't see a viable solution, so they just pivot their attention elsewhere.
We saw this disengagement manifest at the highest political levels. When President Biden gave his first address to the UN General Assembly, his focus was entirely on those global issues.
The pandemic, climate change, competition with China, the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
And he completely omitted the festering crises of the Arab world.
This silence, analysts warn, is politically short-sighted and dangerously risky. Allowing these crises to fester means they will inevitably become uncontrollable threats to U.S. or European interests again.
Because if Europe's eastern and southern borders turn into one huge arc of crisis, the resulting desperation, migration, and instability,
including renewed threats from extremist groups who thrive in vacuums,
will project itself back into Europe and elsewhere. The West can't afford to just ignore this regional economic implosion because it's tired of it.
It can't.
Speaking of Western actors, let's address the international complicity in these authoritarian reversals, particularly in nations where regimes were actively propped up or ignored by powerful allies. Let's look at Bahrain, where protests erupted early and were very quickly crushed.
Human rights groups have explicitly called out the external influence here. They urged the Biden administration to address the widespread crackdown in Bahrain since 2011, detailing the detention of high-profile activists.
And they argued that the previous U.S. administration, by being cozy with Gulf monarchies, sent a clear message to Bahrain's rulers.
A message that prioritized the pursuit of profit before people.
The sources back that argument up with dollars and cents. Under the former administration, Bahrain secured over $8.5 billion in arms deals.
And was involved in the 2020 normalization agreements with Israel, all while engaging in what human rights groups called unrestrained repression of protesters since 2011.
So it seems stability, profit, and geopolitical alignment just trumped any human rights concerns.
And this raises a crucial question about the operational philosophy of foreign policy during these crises. Are powerful allies willing to sacrifice their stated human rights goals for geopolitical stability?
We saw a similar dynamic play out with the ultimate test case, Saudi Arabia.
Right. Despite promising to prioritize human rights, the Biden administration chose not to sanction Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, for the assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Even though we know that intelligence services determined MBS ordered the killing.
Yet the administration chose a path to recalibrate the relationship without causing a full rupture.
So why risk alienating a key regional player, an energy supplier, a counterweight to Iran, even for a crime that shocked the international community?
The decision signals a continued prioritization of powerful geopolitical relationships over accountability. It reinforces the idea for regional strongmen that external pressure will eventually fade,
Allowing them to rebuild the walls of fear and crush dissent without facing serious long-term consequences.
as long as they remain strategically valuable to the West. The message is, essentially, you can get away with anything short of complete national collapse if your strategic value is high enough.
That brings us to the underlying, unresolved structural roots that caused the Arab Spring in the first place, particularly the economic and demographic engine of discontent.
This is where the sheer existential scale of the challenge truly comes into focus, because it's a problem that is only getting bigger,
We have to start with the demographic ticking clock.
which is perhaps the most significant structural risk factor facing the entire region. The Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region, has a massive youth bulge, and it faces an almost incomprehensible challenge.
Which is
It must generate 300 million new jobs by 2050.
300 million. That's a staggering figure. And the sources break down what that means on a month-to-month level.
To simply keep pace with the huge number of new workers entering the market, countries need to start creating 800,000 jobs per month right now.
Not next year, but immediately. To put that into perspective, the U.S. labor market typically celebrates if it adds a few 100,000 jobs in a month.
And this is a 5 to 10 times greater challenge sustained for 30 years.
The magnitude of this challenge is what makes the historical broken social contract completely non-viable.
Right. Historically, authoritarian states in the region maintained political allegiance, and they bought social peace by offering jobs, often in the vast, inefficient public sector.
And providing costly, misguided subsidies for basic goods.
So the contract was, we guarantee stability and a basic livelihood through state employment and cheap bread. But you must remain politically silent.
And this approach allowed authoritarian regimes to suppress political grievances by guaranteeing a basic level of survival.
But that system was economically disastrous. It distorted markets, it fostered corruption, and it became prohibitively expensive due to rising populations, increasing global commodity prices, and fluctuating oil revenue.
Governments just can't afford the price tag anymore, as we've seen demonstrated by the complete collapse in Lebanon and Syria.
And the youth, who are highly educated, are no longer accepting this political silence in exchange for a failed, subsidized existence.
So experts are calling for a sweeping change in trajectory, a revitalization of economies that can't rely on government or public sector hiring to absorb those millions of new workers.
The sources are clear on this. This requires genuinely opening and liberalizing the private sector, radically improving governance standards, and implementing a zero-tolerance approach to the rampant corruption that plagues the region.
Which acts like a massive economic tax on entrepreneurs and investors.
A huge one. You need sweeping changes that allow for rapid growth in high-value, sustainable sectors.
And within that economic structure, the sources highlight what they call the gender paradox as a fundamental break on development.
It's a crucial insight into wasted human capital. Women in the MENA region are often highly educated. They frequently outperform men in academic settings and university enrollment.
Yet only a fraction of them are economically active.
The economic potential being lost by sidelining these highly qualified women is colossal. Opening opportunities for women and fostering their economic empowerment is described by experts as a fundamental axis of progress for the entire region.
Morocco is highlighted in the sources as one country making genuine efforts toward modernity and opening its economy. They're focusing on renewable energy and private sector investment.
But even in success stories like Tunisia back in 2011, the macroeconomic indicators often hid these harsh social realities and deeply ingrained regional inequalities.
Absolutely. The crisis is not just a political failure. It's a failed economic model, coupled with a massive demographic wave that has to be harnessed.
Or it will inevitably cause another larger round of massive disruption. If those 800,000 jobs aren't created every month, the frustration that sparked the Arab Spring will be compounded exponentially.
Yeah, okay, let's shift now from economics to the mechanisms of dissent, the evolution of digital activism. In 2011, there was so much optimism, even euphoria, about how social media would fundamentally change the game.
An era of citizen journalism that would challenge the state narrative.
And it certainly did change the dynamic, at least initially. We saw early successes in Syria, for example, where videos of protesters performing the traditional Dapti dance dominated news coverage.
Those images were peaceful, resilient, and highly mobilizing. They garnered international coverage and Western political attention.
But as the conflict grew more violent, the narrative warped. Suddenly, the media replaced the hopeful term Syrian revolution with the clinical, neutral term Syrian civil war.
And the videos being shared shifted drastically from the resilience of the Dabki to HD footage of ISIL captives being executed and these massive images of refugees flooding onto boats heading to Europe.
Which often triggered xenophobia in Western countries, further isolating the cause.
And the authoritarian regimes quickly learned to fight back. They launched massive digital information warfare campaigns.
The powers that be mobilized what the sources call seas of trolls to drown out or dilute the genuine activist narratives.
Ordinary videos and citizen journalism, especially from Syria, eventually disappeared entirely from the global news cycle. They exceeded the world's attention span and were discredited by a massive influx of state-sponsored disinformation.
But activists learned from these failures. The sources highlight the dramatic success story of the 2019 protests in Sudan.
Yes, Sudanese citizen journalists, armed with 10 years of Arab Spring experience, understood the new rules of the digital road.
Their approach was highly sophisticated. They armed themselves with a keen eye for fake news and troll activity.
They used catchy hashtags, employed high-definition mobile footage specifically chosen to appeal to Western audiences, and they leveraged celebrity mobilization.
And it worked exceptionally well. The movement gained international traction through targeted efforts, most notably with the hashtag #BlueForSudan campaign, which went viral via influential figures like Rihanna.
This forced international attention, and critically, it shifted regional political alliances, leading to the eventual fall of the Omar al-Bashir regime after 30 years.
So the ultimate lesson for today's activists, whether they're working quietly in Egypt under threat in Dara or operating in Sudan, is that they cannot depend solely on social media.
Right, a place where false information roams free and attention spans are brief. They must be innovative, creative, and sophisticated in their delivery.
Their survival and the success of their cause depends on their ability to consistently control and promote the true narrative of their struggle against state power. That brings us to the crucial political lessons learned by regional observers in the last decade. Looking back, the observers themselves admit they were over-optimistic in 2011.
They dramatically underestimated the public's inherent and actually quite limited tolerance for massive political disruptions.
That is a painful realization.
It is. One of the fundamental failures noted was the severe disconnect between the liberal, often secular elites and the average population.
So while the liberal opposition focused heavily on achieving these lofty goals like pluralism, constitutional structures, and elections,
The majority of the population, especially the vast number of people working in the massive informal sector, had entirely different, more immediate priorities.
for the average person, political stability translates directly to the ability to earn a living and feed their family.
And the informal sector is huge. It accounts for at least 50% of the Egyptian population. The liberal goals didn't sufficiently address these core economic realities, which meant they failed to build a broad base of support when the military finally cracked down.
This contrast highlights a major strategic error among the secular and liberal opposition groups.
And this is where the Islamists successfully played the long game. The sources note that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, unlike many liberal camps, invested vast resources and decades into building robust, localized social bases.
They focused on long-term social work delivering services, organizing communities, not just seizing opportunities when they arose.
That sustained social work gave them a structural, foundational advantage even if they ultimately failed politically in Egypt. The lesson is that winning the revolution requires building deep, enduring power from the ground up, not just winning the argument in the capital city.
And the overarching, painful political lesson learned over the last 10 years
Is that the revolutionary radical method of change, the immediate, uncompromising pursuit of regime removal, is extremely dangerous and will probably backfire.
This realization has forced regional observers and activists back to the original, much harder question. Is a credible reform path and gradual change even possible under these regimes?
The focus has shifted drastically. It's moved from revolution to finding ways to foster elite rotation and a slow circulation of ideas and power without upsetting the established military or deep state order too much.
It's a concession that sudden, sweeping change may lead only to the violence and despair we see in Syria.
But despite this massive reversal, the revolutionary spirit isn't extinguished. The revolution still lives in the minds of those who are willing to sacrifice.
We have the extraordinary example of Omar al-Shogur, who endured the branch of slow death.
And now, along with fellow exiled survivors, is actively providing testimony and working tirelessly to hold the Syrian regime accountable in European courts.
And the sources highlight that this testimony led directly to the German prosecution and sentencing of a former intelligence officer, Iyad al-Gharib.
That single sentence, achieved thousands of miles from Damascus, shows that justice is being sought, even as slowly and through unconventional means. The trauma has been adapted and channeled into a powerful driving force for accountability.
The revolution, for those who lost a loved one or were imprisoned, can never truly die.
It can't.
What a profound and often heartbreaking deep dive into the complexities of a decade of reversal. We've traced the painful duality of the last 10 years, the initial success of breaking the fear and overthrowing leaders like Mubarak,
Quickly followed by systemic failures, economic collapse, a return to new, more personalized authoritarianism in Egypt, and massive foreign intrusion in places like Libya and Syria.
If we connect all this to the bigger picture, the sheer scale of that demographic challenge remains the most pressing structural issue. It sits right underneath all the political conflicts.
The frustration that sparked the Arab Spring persists, but now it's compounded by instability, poverty, and war weariness. The region is staring down the barrel of another potential lost decade, or perhaps worse.
Unless leaders can demonstrate the political courage and the legitimacy necessary to enact sweeping economic and governance reforms,
That means abandoning the failed social contract of subsidies and repression. It means instilling zero tolerance for corruption and fundamentally opening the door to private enterprise to harness that enormous, highly educated youth bulge.
if those 800,000 jobs aren't created every single month, the structural fault lines will only widen until the next political or economic earthquake hits.
Indeed. The fundamental necessity is for governments to create genuine space for entrepreneurs, innovators, and risk takers to transform the economies and instill hope. Without that, the talent and the associated wealth creation will simply continue to leave the region.
Leading to a permanent drain of the very human capital needed for reform.
Exactly.
This raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. Many countries are now facing crises where basic survival dominates all thought. It effectively suppresses dissent and prevents political organization. Considering the dire need to create 800,000 jobs per month, what structural failure, political, economic, or social must occur next to shock the region out of its current cycle of repression and exhaustion and truly force the world's attention back to the Middle East before these crises become truly irreversible?